So welcome to our interview series on Technology Impact Assessment, otherwise known as TIA. My name is Katina Michael. I'm a fellow at the Social Cyber Institute in Australia. This interview is part of the Australia-India Joint Impact Assessment of Critical Technologies for Peace and Stability project, funded by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And it's been ongoing since November 2024 and will reach its conclusion this year in November 2025. In this series, we are focusing on technology impact assessment for peace and stability. And today, it gives me great pleasure to have Jürgen Altmann from TU Dortmund in Germany join us. And Jürgen's background, he'll tell us more in a moment, but is a physicist and peace researcher who has dedicated his life to writing about critical and emerging technologies, including an amazing list of military applications with respect to military nanotechnology, space laser weapons and space radars, autonomous weapons, uninhabited aircraft and uninhabited vehicles, perhaps otherwise known as drones, and even small missiles, and much more. So with that, we welcome you, Jürgen. How are you?
Well, good morning from here. Good evening to you. I'm fine. I hope the same holds for you.
Thank you very much. Yes, we've had a cold snap here in Australia. I think it was 0 in Melbourne today, but we've been enjoying some fine weather. Perhaps you can discuss more about your disciplinary background and how you got involved in this space.
Yes, sure. I did a kind of normal molecular physics diploma thesis, what today would be a master's thesis. And then for my doctoral work, I went to a research center, not at the university, to develop a certain environmental measurement technique using laser radar, trying to find environmental pollutions in the free atmosphere from backscattered signals from certain laser wavelengths that we would transmit, and that would be backscattered, and specific absorption at certain wavelengths would indicate the presence or non-presence of certain pollutants at some distance in the direction of our beam. This was technically not fully successful because we couldn't tune the wavelengths of our laser. It was just one with fixed wavelengths, and the chance that these wavelengths were specifically absorbed by the pollutants such as SO2 and NO2 that we looked for did not work out, but it was a successful work, and the experiments worked so far and so on. So I got my PhD degree from the University of Hamburg in 1985. And then there was no possibility to stay in that laser radar area. And so I had the chance to move to the University of Marburg, physics there, and work on pattern recognition, computer pattern recognition, somehow modeled after how the mapping is from the retina, from the human eye, to the cortex, to the visual cortex in the brain. And this was somewhat successful. This was from 1980 to 1984. And during that time, we had this big nuclear missile debate, not only in Europe, not only in Western Europe, also to some extent in Eastern Europe, but also in the US and worldwide. So we in the physics department, together with some active students, thought that we should look at this debate, intermediate range missiles on the one hand, to be deployed or already deployed in the then Soviet Union, and the ones to be deployed by the US in NATO countries in Western Europe from a physics angle. And this then led to a seminar where we treated all kinds of weapons technologies, of course, starting with nuclear weapons, and then going on to what is a missile, what is a rocket, how are the effects of nuclear weapons, and is there a possibility for laser weapons in space, etc. That was 1983, US President Reagan's so-called Strategic Defense Initiative. So in short terms, we learned that present physics still has an effect on and contributes to actual technology armaments in the military field. And so I was kind of alerted to the importance of physics for actual military technology development still, not just, it didn't stop with the development of the nuclear weapons back in 1945. And then when the 5 years employment for computer pattern recognition came to an end, I had the opportunity, together with a second physicist from University of Marburg, to apply at a new fellowship program, just 1-year fellowships, to do research in technical aspects of arms control. And we were approved for this fellowship, and I worked on laser weapons in space, kind of initiated by the Reagan initiative. And then after that year, or when that year came to an end, we were encouraged by the foundation that had funded that project to apply anew for another project. And then I got a 2 years fellowship, and then I worked at the Peace Research Institute Frankfurt, looking at European ballistic missile defense. And when that came to an end, I was encouraged to apply for funding again for founding a little research group. And I thought, what should I look into with such a group, a little group? And my idea was not just to warn against new coming military technologies and their dangers, but also positively to contribute to their prevention or to their limitation. And then I thought that looking into technologies and physics of verification of arms control agreements would be good. But since activity worldwide in this area was already going on in the field of nuclear weapons disarmament verification, I thought that there is a gap in the verification, in particular by technology and conventional arms reductions. And so I was granted that money, or to be more precise, the Ruhr University Bochum in Germany got that money, and I was employed then more or less with some sequential prolongations for 5 years. And we did research into how you could find or detect whether certain heavy military vehicles cross certain designated lines, either in a disarmament or in a peacekeeping context. And we made experiments measuring acoustic, seismic, and magnetic signals of tanks and heavy trucks, etc., etc., also taking off and landing military aircraft. And all this was kind of interesting and suspenseful, getting permission to do these measurements on military training grounds or military air bases, etc. And we learned quite a bit. And now I think we have built the foundation for building verification of such movements by automatic sensors. However, it's just the research, and if one wants to use them, one will have to do some more development, etc. But this is no longer an area of physics research. So this is what I did 5 years at the Ruhr University Bochum, and then already then, in parallel, I had looked into certain kinds of military technologies like before, and then I got consecutive grants for looking at the international security implications of certain potential new military technologies or military uses of technology. And I did this then thereafter, more or less up to now, with some interruptions because the projects weren't exactly following each other. There was some unemployment break in between, and some freelance work for the German parliament, etc. But this is how I got into this area, and I find it still interesting, and it's still, I think, important. However, I have to say that of the very many proposals that I made for preventive limitation of new military technologies, and that many others, or not so many, but a few others worldwide in physics and chemistry, etc., have proposed, not always, or very rarely, to be honest, have states taken up such proposals. So I'm kind of disappointed on the one hand, but looking at the history of the Cold War and how long it took to get from mutual threats to at least to some kind of mutual limitations, let's say, of nuclear weapons, one has to acknowledge that this is just a long-term process. And just at the moment, the outlook is, of course, very dim for progress, or even going back to certain stages of mutual arms limitations. But nevertheless, if you think in terms of international security, and even of an enlightened concept of national security of the most important states, such as US, Russia, and China, they should understand that they can only be secure sustainably if they reduce or at least limit their respective military systems. So it is still important. Maybe I can add, I'm not fully working against fighting against windmills, but I do, and a few other colleagues worldwide do research to put it kind of on the shelf. So if all of a sudden a miracle occurs, such as occurred with Michael Gorbachev taking over the commanding post in the then Soviet Union in 1985, if such a miracle occurs again, then, and politically so many arms control treaties would become possible again, as was the case after 1985, 87, 1990, etc. Kind of a little avalanche of arms control treaties occurred. So if such a thing would occur again in the future, then one could conclude these treaties relatively fast, as had been done in those times, and not needing to do 5 years waiting of the results of research how such limitations could be verified.
I find this to be a fascinating background, especially for someone so technical, to be working in what perhaps others could label a form of activism or advocacy. How did you,
Well,
yes,
I'd say there's a colleague who is kind of a role model for me, Frank von Hippel at Princeton University in the US. He used to call himself a scientist activist. And when I call myself still an activist, still a scientist, but if somebody calls me an activist as well, I do not object.
that is very clear, I think, from the type of work, which leads us on to the question of technology impact assessment. And we talk about preventive approaches, precautionary approaches, and perhaps even post-adoption. How do you view technology impact assessment in your work through different timescales?
Well, maybe we will discuss the term a little later, but I usually call it somewhat simpler technology assessment. And to be specific, it's military technology assessment. So technology assessment at large is about looking at potential new technologies or potential new uses of technologies in society, and looking what would be their benefits, or what could be risks and dangers, etc. And then, in a sense, providing handles for political decision makers to kind of steer the technology towards the beneficial applications and away from the risky or more dangerous ones. And in military technology assessment, that's the area that I specialize in, if you wish. It is not very often been looked at in TA, even though I think it has quite a tradition in technology assessment. So technology assessment, in some sense, stems from science and technology studies, STS. And much of STS, as far as I understand it, has been founded or has been started with looking at military technologies and their diffusing into the civilian realm and vice versa, and is military technology advancing faster than civilian technology, etc., etc. And so there is a certain, I haven't read the history of that, but a certain common history between science and technology studies on the one hand and technology assessment as a research field on the other. But this has been forgotten by and large by the technology assessment community worldwide. Even in this recent book of 2023, I think, on globalization in TA, there's not a single sentence about military applications, even though if one thinks of global aspects in technologies, the military ones are among the major relevant ones. Okay, so this is what I call military technology assessment. And I'd say this can be done with two different views. The first view would be, how can we use military technologies and use the benefits for the combat strength of our own armed forces? And this is the usual task of all kinds of planning groups and sub-institutions in defense ministries and armed forces, etc. When they plan new armaments, what could be useful for the next type of kind of combat aircraft, or how fast could we go to uninhabited combat things, etc., etc. So this is a first kind where people can do technology assessment, and there's no dearth of that in the world, at least in the countries that are militarily powerful. But much of this then is not public, and it is not often open to scrutiny, to public scrutiny. With some exceptions, of course, the US is very relatively transparent, and there are other countries such as China, which is fairly intransparent in new technologies for the military, and even France and other countries, and Germany too, is not that transparent. But in general, the outcome of such military-oriented or combat strength-oriented TA is not fully public. Of course, the reason being that military secrecy is part of effectiveness in combat. So if you know more about your potential enemy, you can more effectively fight against him. So this is the first stream, or first, how do you say that, strand of
Yes.
military technology assessment. And the second is a technology assessment that is being done with a view towards maintaining or even improving international peace and military stability. And we may talk a little later about what that means. But this is the second thing, which kind of is is oriented along the interests of humankind in preventing war and preventing instances or situations where countries that threaten each other may unintentionally glide or coalesce into war. So it is public interest work, so to speak, in the interest of the global public. And it's not really, not very often done, unfortunately. And it is all the more important right now. And I see your project, the Indian-Australian project, as kind of part of that rejuvenation of military technology assessment. But between these two, there is no gap or no real, well, how do you say that? A deep valley in between. However, no, you can make a link if countries would understand, and some of them have understood it in earlier times better, if they would understand that The national security can sustainably only be maintained in the context of international security with mutual limitations of things that threaten each other and that could give cause for escalation in a crisis, etc. They could do such work as well. And to some extent, for instance, there are some military establishments who have been part of verification research for the disarmament, the actual disarmament of nuclear weapons. So there is a certain link. But I think if you would ask for the relationship between those international scientists and engineers who work in military technology assessment for the armed forces on the one hand, and for global security and military stability on the other, there will probably be a factor of 100 or more between the numbers and the resources that are being spent in these areas.
I often ask myself as a parent about military technology, and of course we have so many examples dating back to World War II in particular of more modern technologies and how they have been diffused commercially after their development and diffusion in the military, and perhaps many benefits that we have felt as consumers, but at the same time the threats that these technologies also maintain within a military context. And many people argue that sometimes when we do weigh up the benefits and costs, the costs outweigh the benefits seemingly in the military context, whether you're using it for offense or defense or both. And there seems to be a continued escalation with new competitive edges between nation states and, as you said, some secrecy and not open source material when we are developing blueprints or even conceiving of these potential mechanisms, whatever they are, tools, objects, artifacts, processes, whatever it is. Given where we are in the world today, and this is more a general question about the value of TIA or the value of technology assessment, are there naysayers who say, forget it, technology assessment is not going to do much when we are unleashing military technologies, and so you can keep doing your technology impact assessments, but it won't go anywhere? What do you say to those people who say that technology assessment or technology impact assessment is ineffective in its cause? How do you respond? What is the value of TIA?
It provides reliable knowledge, credible information that can be used to base political decisions on. But ultimately, it's a political question. And if countries do not agree to mutual limitations in new military technologies, they are kind of, well, not doomed, but they have to continue with an increasing arms race, a qualitative one with new technologies. And all the time, things are getting faster at present, to some extent taking war and peace decisions out of the hands of human control. And just because of time pressure being forced to allow decision-making by machines or by computers. And this is fairly dangerous, but if countries don't understand that this is dangerous or don't draw the common conclusions out of that, then, well, they are forced to exactly follow that course. They will spend more money on destructive technology, and they will create in kind of silent cooperation, will cooperatively move into a situation where their respective security is decreased. And we as TA people can point that out and raise our fingers and inform the public and maybe a small part of a political process to change that insight or to move through that insight. But the main influence for changes in this very fundamental political direction has to come from other societal movements. So in the early 80s, we had these big peace movements more or less all over the industrialized world, and they had quite some political influence, with some lucky things such as Gorbachev coming in between. But nevertheless, so if you think, or if one understands that the fundamental political direction of the big countries has to change, it won't come about by TA. It will have to be by more political factors. But academia, for instance, academia at large, for instance, can play a great role. Also, collaboration among scientists of the different potential enemy countries. So I want to point out the role of the Pakbosh conferences on world and international affairs, who preconceived all kinds of nuclear limitation agreements, which then decades later became kind of accepted by, for instance, then bilaterally by the USA and the then Soviet Union, and or globally, as in the case of the prohibition of biological and chemical weapons. So I think it needs quite a few more factors or societal movements than just the TA people who point at the potential dangers, but they play a certain role because they can provide arguments for the other movements to take up, and we have certain influences seen of that, for instance, in the debate in the US in the late 60s and early 70s, whether there should be anti-ballistic missile systems deployed in the US. And this insight was then, for instance, written in the the journal Scientific American, and all kinds of local initiatives used these arguments, and the same happened at least in Western Europe or in Germany, where I know it best, in the early 80s when it was about the intermediate range nuclear missiles. So such work is important, but to be politically influential, it needs more forces or more factors.
Thank you for that example. And tell us, given your expertise, what do you appreciate when you see a technology assessment?
Well, I should say that the German parliament, that has an Office of Technology Assessment of its own, to some extent modeled after the earlier Office of Technology Assessment in the US that was unfortunately closed in 1996, but ours, TAB, Büro für Technikfolgenabschätzung beim Deutschen Bundestag, is still active. So they had a project on preventive arms control, I think back in 96 plus minus. And there and in the following, a certain number of colleagues and groups in Germany, just 3 groups and maybe a good handful of colleagues, tried to work more systematically how military technology assessment and then preventive arms control should work. And we developed a set of certain criteria that can be used to look at a certain potential new military technology or potential new use of existing technologies in the military, and then judge, should this be looked at more closely, and could this provide certain problems, and then look at what could be done. So these criteria have to do with international humanitarian law, so that certain kinds of weapons would endanger the basic rules such as discrimination between combatants and civilians in armed combat. Would it be the potential for new weapons of mass destruction, etc.? And the second group has to do with military stability and prevention of war. So if a new technology would kind of undermine or endanger certain arms control treaties that are already there, then there is a potential problem and one should look at it. Is there the risk of a strong arms race technologically? And finally, a third group has to do with the use of potential new military technologies already in peacetime. Do they handle dangerous substances? Of course, if with chemical weapons, it would be the case, but maybe also with certain kinds of fuels for missiles or whatever. So there's a group of 3x3 criteria that one could systematically apply to a certain potential new military technology or use. And then if in one or more of these criteria there's reason for concern, one should look at it more closely. And if the concern is being assessed as being really strong, then one should do the next step and think about in research, how could these more dangerous or most dangerous applications be prevented or maybe limited somehow? And this then has a certain set of considerations that needs to be done. So this is no longer military technology assessment. This is preventive arms control then, or research for preventive arms control. That is arms control that applies before a certain weapon system has been deployed to the forces or being used or has been is being acquired. So in many, or the question then is, if one wants to apply limitation for a certain new military technology, let's take laser weapons. Do we want to prohibit lasers, for instance? So where do we want to have the limits? Lasers have so many civilian possible uses in dental care, for instance, or in geodesy, measuring movement of Earth continents, etc., etc. So probably one would allow all kinds of civilian laser uses, but certain laser uses in the civilian realm might come very close to potential weapons. And under such civilian uses, they might be a guise for kind of covert military development. So one needs certain thresholds for civilian uses for such technologies, so that doesn't come too close to military development. And in the military area proper, question is, at which stage of a new military technology should limitations apply? So from a completely preventive and prohibitive approach, one would say everything. Don't do research in this area, don't develop it further, don't acquire it, and of course not use it. But in many cases, the stage of research is difficult to limit for several reasons. In many cases, even if you do applied research, you don't know from the beginning what will be the outcome. That's what research is for. And so limiting research explicitly is normally not part of such limitations. But the stage of development, if you want to be complete and have a big gap between research on the one hand and potential military deployment and use later, one would like to prohibit development already and then testing, and then of course acquisition and finally use. So there are a couple of examples of treaties such as the Chemical and Biological Weapons Convention, where already development and testing, not just possession and use, are prohibited. However, there's one example where only use was prohibited. That's the protocol on laser blinding weapons within the context of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons in the United Nations, where only use is prohibited. This is on lasers that produce permanent blindings, permanent blinding in the eyes of people. And after some discussion, whether it would be worse to be blind than to be dead, and that laser blinding would be positive activity on the battlefield, then the international community changed their view and said, no, it's a cruel weapon, and people after a war would remain damaged with no eyesight for the rest of their lives, etc. So then what they said, okay, we do prohibit only the use in combat, in armed combat. And nevertheless, because there was no legal possibility to use them, the countries that had been active in research for blinding laser weapons or in development stopped that as well, just to save money and use it for more militarily, in quotes, useful research and or development. But that's a rare example in those cases, such as I mentioned with chemical and biological weapons. Their development and testing is already prohibited. I find that important. Laser blinding weapons were just not that relevant militarily. So it was easy to just conclude from their ban on use to not just fund further development and testing on them. However, in other areas, such as at present autonomous weapon systems, I'm arguing since quite some while for a prohibition of autonomous attack. But the military effect of these systems would be so great that a simple ban on use only would not help. Countries would develop them, would test them, and then would be would be under great threat if war would break out, to actually use them. Nevertheless, they are all there, they have been acquired, etc. So preventive arms control that is really relevant and sustainable for militarily important technologies would need to include development and testing as well, not just use or acquisition. And as I said, in some such treaties, these conditions are being met.
That gives us a lot of insight into how to categorize critical emerging technologies within the military context, and an interesting point you raise about the application of technology. And perhaps, if we say to ourselves, the minute we can name a military application is not too late, but the genie is out of the bottle, and what we are trying to do is perhaps prevent its use in a particular context, or consider it in the wider context with respect to both national and international security within the legal frameworks that we have available to us.
This is a principal problem. Of course, the Colin-Ridge dilemma. If certain technology is not yet really ready, nobody knows, or not many people know about the consequences. But if it has arrived, and all the accidents and whatever happen, it may be too late to prohibit them after they have been deployed widely. It may be possible, as has been done with CFCs, ozone deleting gases in the upper atmosphere. So they were prohibited from use as coolants, etc., etc. But this was all civilian. If armed forces have introduced something on a large scale and feel dependent on their functioning in combat, in battle, it would be much more difficult. So here we have this problem. We cannot point, for instance, as to autonomous weapons, we cannot point at so many unintentionally wars that have broken out because of interactions between autonomous fleets of enemies in a crisis. So we can just point at the principal possibility and make it plausible. But conviction that this is really important and that one should do something about would unfortunately only come from a first such incidents. But if that escalates even up to nuclear war, it may be very late to actually draw consequences. So this is a principal problem. But nevertheless, as I said earlier, I think pointing the dangers out and trying to convince people and to get certain political factors moving is nevertheless relevant and important.
A good point to reinforce here is technology assessment can be used anywhere on that technology application lifecycle. That's what we're saying, even before it's widespread diffusion, hopefully and preferably. But if it is diffused, you can still apply it. And a question I have in my mind is whether we see technology assessment as an ongoing artifact and process rather than a cross-sectional snapshot and white paper or, result of an assessment. Is your view that we are moving towards something more fluid that contains possibly risk registers that are either dealt with or addressed early on and then perhaps allowing a technology to flourish in a particular context? Or you think that's not possible? We need still these cross-sectional studies to be done at different times in the life cycle. Do you think it's a continuous process over a life cycle, or do you think it's snapshots over time?
Well, ideally, it would be a continuing process accompanying, for instance, certain prohibitions. Do they work, or are they in danger of being undermined by some side aspect of the new technology? Do we need to sharpen the criteria for prohibition or for regulation? Yes. And colleagues of mine and in Germany and elsewhere have since, I would say, 2 decades proposed an advisory body at the UN Secretary General for looking systematically and continuously at the development in military technologies and advising the UN and then, of course, the member states about certain dangers that could be limited or contained by maybe preventive regulation. Yes, but such a thing is not yet in existence. Another proposal from our side that hasn't been taken up by the international community, but the UN has an advisory board on disarmament matters. And from time to time, at least this more general body looks at new military technology. I myself have been invited a couple of times to present there, but the amount of technical expertise there is limited. It's mostly diplomats, which is okay with me. But nevertheless, a body that would specifically look at new technologies and their potential military uses and the dangers from them is dearly needed, and it does not yet exist. Given that such an advisory board is not yet there, it is important that academia worldwide is looking into this. And by nature, much of this will be snapshot kind studies. It depends on funding, of course. I myself have done several types of studies and had to apply for specific funding for each kind of technology that I had looked at. And so somewhat more, or not somewhat, but considerably more funding for systematic technology assessment in the military area is needed. And I call on all kinds of funders to strengthen their expenses there. And we are in some good shape in Germany. So, for instance, the German Foreign Ministry is funding peace research institutes for their respective work, not only in political science, but also in military technology assessment. I understand that the Australian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade is doing the same with your project that you are doing just now.
Tell us, Jürgen, who are the main stakeholders that are related to technology impact assessments, and who is the audience?
Well, I think most of the stakeholders I already mentioned. On the one hand, it's the researchers who actually do work in these areas. On the other hand, it is non-governmental organizations that kind of try to organize public, well, opposition or public movements. Again, in the field that I have been active in since, let's say, nearly 20 years, autonomous weapon systems. There is a campaign to stop killer robots, an international one with 260 or so non-governmental organizations worldwide that try to convince their respective publics, but also decision makers, that limitations or prohibition of autonomous weapon systems would be necessary and good for international peace and stability. So that's the second one. That's the what's the non-governmental organizations, and in a sense the general public. And there are decision makers who have to decide on where to put military funds into the area of new technologies. There are the diplomats that are the practitioners of negotiating limitations in the military field. On the one hand, the existing ones, capping numbers of nuclear weapons, or, as I said, in preventive arms control, trying to negotiate preventive limits on new technologies, and some such well, expert discussions among diplomats are already going, for instance, for autonomous weapons. Since 2013 in the UN in Geneva, I have been sitting in there as an observer and from time to time. However, it hasn't gotten to any very useful mandate for actual limitations. So it's a difficult process, just as an example. So these are the stakeholders. And to some extent, it's the weapons research establishments who have some possibility to look into methods of disarmament or of verification of compliance of disarmament. That's about the stakeholders, and the audience, I think, is more or less the same. We write for the colleagues worldwide. We write for the scientific public at large. So the hope is that some of our colleagues in normal physics, chemistry, biology, computer science, what have you, will take up such ideas, and when they give lectures on aspects of the application of their respective science, that they include military aspects and the problems they might ensue on the one hand, and limitation possibilities on the other in their teaching. But also, of course, the general public, the journalists, the media, and the non-governmental organizations, and also the decision makers. From time to time, colleagues from military technology assessment are being invited to parliamentary committees, in particular when the parliament itself has a technology assessment office. Just as an aside, the German Office of Technology Assessment exists now since 25 or so years, but nevertheless, they have not done more than maybe 10 projects with military technology among the, well, rough guess, 150 or so projects on civilian uses of technology. Nevertheless, I applaud them, and I try to tell them, please look better at this, but they can't propose projects by themselves. They have to wait for an initiative out of members of parliament that ask them to do some research.
When we talk about joint technology impact assessments, say Germany and another country, do you believe these are already happening, to your knowledge, where there are nations together exploring the impact of a technology?
Well, nations sounds like governments, official representatives, and I'm not aware of any such thing between government, and I would see the project that you are doing at the moment. It's called Indian-Australian, but as I understand, it's an academic endeavor, which is good, of course, no criticism, but it's not among the governments or
Yes.
between the governments. And in Germany, I'm not aware of any government-to-government activity on military technology assessment between Germany and any other country. There is some informal activity going on in the European Union, but it has a hard time translating the civilian limits, where they are very good and value-oriented, European values, etc., such as in artificial intelligence and data security. They have a hard time transferring that to the military realm because it is outside of the legislative how do you say that in English area that the EU is setting rules for. Military problems are still in the national responsibility, so it's very difficult. So some informal contacts may exist, but I'm not aware of any systematic thing, unfortunately. And of course, the EU would be a good role model, being a supranational body with 27 members, where they could agree to have certain standards on their respective own military technologies, certain thresholds that they would not cross, etc. But of course, all this has to be seen in the context of a global arms race and threats, military threats that they see and that they prepare. So it is a difficult area. But yes, joint is very much needed, but not really done.
I think you've addressed some of the barriers to doing things jointly in a bilateral, multilateral context. Do you see any shortcomings to technology assessment, any limitations or even misuses in the military application context?
Shortcomings? Well, I think academic military TA is mainly hindered by a lack of funds. So there's not much systematically being done. In Germany, we just have, again, 2 small chairs looking into verification research and a little bit more, and the center at the Peace Research Institute Frankfurt. The chairs in physics, by the way, in Darmstadt, collaborating with Frankfurt and in Hamburg. So it's good that these things exist, but the personnel and money resources that they have available are limited. So some more systematic activity or some more funding would allow much more systematic activity. So this is a shortcoming of the conditions for such work, not of that work as such. In the contributions of military research and development institutions, I would say they could do much more. From time to time, certain institutions are being asked to do work. For instance, the nuclear weapons establishments in the US, in Russia, and in the UK have been tasked with some activity on verification technologies together with the International Atomic Energy Agency in earlier times. So some things happen, but I think the big activity, or well, 99.9% of the activity is towards military strength. But from this 0.01%, they could expand to, let's say, at least 1%. Would be good. So this is another shortcoming of the military TA being done in military research and development establishments. Let's see, misuses. Shortcomings, one could also say, well, our access to decision makers could be better. If there were bigger centers, they might pay for personnel who does public relations towards the public and relations to decision makers. And the 2 German big peace research institutes, they have their offices at Berlin, directly tasked with making contacts to politicians and ministries, but this is not focused on military technology assessment. It's just on general peace research aspects, which is again important, but the military TA aspect could be made much bigger if there were systematic funding for reaching out. Okay, misuses. Let's see. One could hypothetically think of certain things, but well, not many come to my mind at the moment. No, I know, of course, fairly many examples of military TA in the last 50 or so years, or maybe 70 years, if you wish, or 60. Well, if one warns of certain dangers in an abstract terms, some such warnings could be used by people wanting to get more funds for military technology by pointing out at the dangers if one's enemy gets the hands on that. So this could be a kind of misuse, but one doesn't need military technology assessment in the academic field or towards peace and stability to make such arguments. It's rather the other way around. Military TA with peace and stability in mind rather tends to bring a more rational view to that and not echo just all the worst case assumptions that come out of military press or of armament firms who want to sell more gadgets, but could rather point out, well, the threat is on the potential enemy side is not that big at the moment, and you will probably provoke them to do more if our side goes forward, etc. So I don't see many such misuses now.
Do you remain optimistic about the role of TA as a function to ensure arms control and prevention of the development of particular types of military technologies that are critical, increasingly becoming complex and continuing to converge? So we talk about sometimes autonomous weapons as being very different to AI, being very different to individual advancements, but in actual fact now they're coming together in very complex ensembles and very converged manifestations.
Again, first, a general remark, autonomous weapon systems can function without AI.
Yes.
So you can program certain images of tanks, of enemy tanks, and just program that into the targeting algorithms of such systems. And AI can be used much beyond autonomous weapons. So yes, they kind of come together, they converge in a sense, and many autonomous weapon systems, if they actually will come into being, will use AI in one way or the other, at least in the preparation and the programming stage, but maybe also during actual use in combat, which produces dangers in itself. We might talk about that, but maybe that's too special. But yes, about the role of TI towards arms control and preventive limitations, I remain generally optimistic. But concerning the present situation, I'm not very optimistic. And this comes from the experience of the last, whatever, 10 or so years, or last 5 years. There are many indications that the most militarily important countries prepare all kinds of new technologies to overcome the potential enemy in combat and to decide faster, etc., etc. So the tendency at the moment in the military technical and military political field is rather negative there. As I said earlier, so our research rather provides a basis for a situation when politically limitations become much more possible and acceptable. But if we hadn't had such research, such political developments would have a harder time, because the implementation would then need more research, which would not have been done before. And you can prove that with all kinds of historical events that led to the various, mostly bilateral, but also multilateral arms control agreements. So one needs to have the optimism that it is fundamentally and finally useful. But at the moment, the outlook is dim. But certain events might cause to a change in the views of the most important decision makers in the most important countries. And my hope, and this is, well, some degree of optimism, that not a very big crisis will be needed to provide that insight, that something else, just rational insight, provides such a change, and not just a very big global crisis. We may have all kinds of crises coming out of climate change, out of immigration, of local wars, and then interactions between high-tech armies in a heavy crisis, escalating into war, and finally maybe even into nuclear war. So the crises could come relatively easily. And as I said, I very much hope that they are not needed for such insight, but the political climate worldwide, or in the most important countries, needs to change. And well, we have to silently or calmly work for it, and hope that political factors, as I mentioned before, will contribute to such change.
Thank you. They're very wise words, and I think about this
Okay.
all the time. We can't continue to progress at the speed of development, and also without thinking about the big picture view of what our innovations might mean. And I think recently we were exchanging something at a workshop together with a group that somehow perhaps we need to get this message not just to the politicians, of course, who make the decisions, but also to the actual manufacturing ecosystem that produces these capabilities. And perhaps they don't realize the bigger picture of what they're contributing to as solo players. You know, they have an economic mandate, they have shareholders, they have engineers, and they're producing, but perhaps without that knowledge about the impacts, as you say, through your talk today.
One could add a qualifier that would be technology assessment, as you did for peace and stability. I would even expand this a little, saying for peace, international security, and military stability, to be even a bit more specific. One problem, or not a problem, but one proposal would be to explicitly include the preventive arms control aspect into it. So the assessment as such is just the first stage, but if one would work towards, as you call it, peace and stability, then certain preventive limitations, I think, should be in view as well. And I haven't seen such in your project, to be honest, as of now, but it's just a short project and a start, and just 12 months. So it could be added at a later stage, I guess.
And I asked this question not because we are looking for different names, but rather in the guts of it, Jürgen, when we conduct a technology assessment or a technology impact assessment, and the latter being one where we look at the unintended and intended consequences and anticipated and unanticipated consequences, and it was more a view on the consequences and the impact of these military technologies and other technologies, of course, which the Australian government have called critical emerging technologies. And many now we're seeing this wave around ICT, critical ICT, as if this is something different to just ICT. But I ask this because I'm trying to get, and the team is trying to get to the heart of what a technology assessment is about, in the sense of really deep down, is it about as we said, peace and stability, but we are doing this because we are basically saying, as one academic piece of literature said, ethical technology assessment, or in their case, they had actually put the TIA in there, but they called it with a small e, ethical technology impact assessment. And the question of ethics, we really haven't talked about ethics, but I think almost everything you're talking about is about ethics, human behavior and ethics, political processes and ethical processes in politics and so forth. Are supposed to be teaching this to our students, but I think you're a great example where your research and your teaching, where you have been able to be in the classroom, actually remind students that ethics and all of these other things, socio-political, socio-economic, all of these other factors, environmental / legal, regulatory, all of this is important in TIA.
Ethics is a very wide term. And you could also have military ethics,
Yes.
and which is important, but one could also argue it's ethically, or you are ethically obliged to provide your armed forces with the best technology possible,
Yes.
neglecting all the international ramifications, the escalation possibilities, the crisis instability that can ensue, and the arms races, etc. So if you want an adjective, I think, well, ethical is okay if you add, let's say, peace and stability or international security things as well. And I think that's a fundamental question. What is the ethics in international relations? My country strong or prevent war and other humankind's crises, etc. So I think this should be at the outset, and I only mention it now, but of course implicitly it was all the time my motivation. If I conceive of military technology assessment, it's just with this ethical view, war is bad and should be prevented. Maybe not at all cost. There might be reasons to sometimes to actually engage in war, but these should be the very rare exceptions, and they should be done under very stringent conditions, and optimally, of course, under the UN auspices. And then this raises the question of UN reform, abrogation of the veto in the Security Council, etc., etc. But that's a very general discussion we might lead at another time.
Yes, we will. To our final question, I know I've kept you an hour, 10 minutes now, but is there anything else you wish to add that you didn't get an opportunity to talk about in this interview?
Well, not much concerning my work, but concerning your project. I note that let me start the other way around. Arms control is important between countries that prepare for mutual war. So the country that is your potential enemy in war is the best partner for mutual limitations. Of course, we now get into the problem. We have 3 parties and not just 2 as in the Cold War, etc., etc. But nevertheless, limitations are relevant for those countries that prepare for warring against each other. And so I was again wondering why in this Australian-Indian context, nobody up to now at least spoke about doing something between Australia and China, or between India and China, or between India and Pakistan. There are preparations for war between India and Pakistan. We just had a kind of starting of a war, which fortunately was then calmed down again very fast. So if one thinks of TIA for peace and stability, involving Australia on the one hand and India on the other, I think the most natural partners would be China and Pakistan. This may be politically very difficult, but I think that's what I would think about when I would be asked, what would you do in preventive arms control or in technology assessment, starting from Australia and India.
This is a great point that I will share with the team, and you have raised so many great points throughout the last 8 or 9 interactions that we've all had together in different webinars, roundtables, and workshops. And I think, there's a lot to discuss there regarding diplomacy, but also conflict resolution. And often, perhaps in this instance, we don't want to resolve the conflict or potential conflict. Therefore, we don't speak to potential enemy states or enemy states as they are considered today. We stick to allies and try to figure out processes. And often, when we have been exploring this idea of joint impact assessment, technology assessment, or bilateral assessment, going on to multilateral in the region, perhaps in the Quad states, we've tried to start at the beginning where we're saying, but how would this work in practice, this joint TIA? How can we start to maneuver and look at existing case studies? And there are existing case studies, as you mentioned, climate change before, as well as the health sector. We have seen sort of joint statements being conducted and joint assessments. But, we mentioned stakeholder roles, and you very much astutely talked about new roles that need to be created so that there is this uh, uh, process between parties, between governments at different layers and well known. So in the German government, as you mentioned, you do have an Office of Technology Assessment, as there once was in the USA, and the counterparts would know if they were still in existence between each state. Way forward, we're thinking about is perhaps do this with allied partners first, figure out sort of who is on the other side, and then, as you say, I think the most useful to cease conflicts and negotiate and come to conflict resolution at that national level is to have those difficult discussions with neighbors who perhaps um, uh, are not on first speaking terms casually. So you raise a very good point there. If we want to ensure peace and stability, we better be talking to the people that may not be so stable with respect to our hopes, our dreams, our vision in whatever regional area we are discussing in context. But this is a big point. I don't know if you've done further research in that and you have anything further to add there.
No, not at the moment. It's just a general remark.
Yes.
I would encourage you, technology assessment among military allies is, well, maybe a little useful, but where it's needed is on another front, to speak militarily.
Yes. Yes. And yes, Jürgen, and that could be the beginning of dialogue that's, as you say, going to lead to real, actual change that may enhance our security, the securitization of nation states. But I think that is very wise.
Another aspect in this, when certain countries on the official level are not yet ready to sit down in actual negotiations, then in many cases academia can play a certain role and has played a role with so-called track 2 discussions. So if they have some contacts to their respective governments, but they informally can exchange views in a kind of protected settings, not necessarily public,
Yes.
as had been done in the Pagosh conferences from the beginning. First one was 1957. They can help get something underway, and this was done successfully several times between the US and then the then USSR. So maybe something such could be set up as well. They were not on the verge, but there had been discussions about should they become nuclear states and should have developed nuclear weapons, etc. And the respective physics societies came together and developed a scheme, the so-called ABAC, ABACC, where the countries agreed, and they have respective inspections. So on the proposal from the physics societies of both countries, the countries then came together and agreed on inspections to make sure, in addition to those of the IAEA, to make sure that all civilian nuclear activities and materials remain in civilian uses. Of course, Argentina and Brazil didn't really pose a military threat against each other, but with nuclear weapons, it might have developed to such. So this is another more easier example. So why shouldn't the academic partners of your present project kind of make informal contacts to potential partners in the two important potential enemy countries that I mentioned, and try to do some track 2 dialogue? I know that some such thing has been underway in the field of artificial intelligence between US and China colleagues. Maybe Australia and India could chime in there or in another technological field and see what can come out of it.
These are beautiful thoughts and reflections, and I think unique to someone of your knowledge, but also it demonstrates the importance of alternate habits of mind, to think imaginatively about what is possible. And I do think academics believe in their charter. That's why they study what they do and they spend endless hours researching. But often we think it's out of our reach, either due to funding, the political unrest or situations elsewhere. But I think what you're telling us is to step up and be brave with our thinking about what is possible, and to use this project as a launch pad to greater possibilities, but to start small as we are doing, and to hopefully build a community of practice, which has been one of our aims, that people like yourself, experts in the area, are able to come and share with us this knowledge and their experience, case studies and other things. But I love what you're saying. Often we feel powerless as academics, and we are, you know, uh, in the production mill of creating papers for publication. But this is, where the rubber hits the road, as we say. This is actually being at the coalface and taking these things forward as possibilities. So if we don't think about them and breathe them and offer them as possibilities, they won't happen. But this is a wonderful feedback from yourself, Jürgen, and the team will consider what you're saying, and both in India and Australia.
I wish you good luck in that.
We need it. And more human resources, as you said, this can't happen without funding and resources, but humans that love this area because they believe this is in the long-term securitization of the world. Because I do. I personally think if we don't do this in a cooperative way, we can't determine tomorrow, but there's a number of conflicts that are out of control at the moment that are really difficult for children, teenagers, young people to observe, but also parents who are not part of the baby boomers. We are post this period in the West. And it's our parents who lived through aspects of World War II, or were born during World War II, and we don't wish to go into another state of unrest at that scale ever again. But there are many, many conflicts around the world where I wish these outcomes were not occurring. The world is calling out for change.
Yes.
Thank you, Jürgen, for all your time. This is the first interview of a series of interviews. We don't know how many we will do with experts around the world in technology assessment or technology impact assessment. But we will be offering them on the Social Cyber Institute page for anyone who wishes to see recordings of our webinars where people like Jürgen have participated actively and provided their wealth of knowledge. But if you have any feedback after listening to our discussion, please do reach us on publicly available sites, and we would like to hear from people. Thank you, Jürgen.
Thank you.